Evolution theory, according to Darwin and others, describes man's animal and sensory development from the first microbe. No explanation is offered for his incomparable creative and artistic powers. According to the theory, he is just a better kind of ape. On the other hand, biblical and other religious traditions report some kind of divine or mystical creation in which man appeared physically fully formed and imaginatively inventive as we know him today. These two great opposing ideas, evolution theory and creation theory, actually represent the two sides of man, his mystifying dual nature, the sensory, physical, and vitally creative. Evolutionists and naturalists like Darwin and so many others in our own time have contributed enormously to our understanding and appreciation of nature as the perfect system of perpetual motion. But what of the evolutionist himself, not his organism, but the intelligence, the creative brilliance or genius with which he cognizes the nature system? What will be the result if he observed and catalogued this unique system of intelligence in himself with the same patience and dedication as he studies the formal, natural world around him? By demarking a point some tens of thousands of years ago, when Homo sapiens, modern creative man, emerged out of the animal lineage of flesh and instinct, science tacitly acknowledges the occurrence of a unique and extraordinary event in time. It affirms that somewhere, sometime during the countless ages of Homo, the biological order of primates, which includes monkeys and apes, development, man acquired his sapience, sense of knowing, discernment, that unprecedented humanizing addition to his animal nature, and that this sapient factor is the other half of him, the missing link in the otherwise elegant scientific theory. It is a little-known fact that the sense-perceived world is organized in such a way that every stage of man's past evolution as a race is represented, literally recorded, in the phenomena around him. Consequently, the scientist is able to collect his solid fossilized evidence, preserved in the earth, and gradually assemble a rational model of man's animal evolution. To understand evolution before man appeared on Earth, before there were selves, which we as men are today, it is necessary to grasp that man was a principle, not yet an entity. Man was the principle of intelligence behind all evolving forms of life. The intelligence who organized the evolution of the physical species. Through the evolution of the physical species on Earth, man as the principle of intelligence was then able to evolve the human body to his own specifications. He did this over an enormous tract of time, by gradually entering from the unconscious a partly developed physical body prepared for him by the earlier evolution of the rest of the species. The preparation of this body was the fundamental task of evolution. Every form ever taken by the Earth's evolving species, from bacteria to primates, was a branch of the tree of life along which traveled the impulse that finally appeared as modern creative man, the self-conscious culmination of all the species. Evolutionary theory, being based on external observation, has no knowledge of any of this. The essential point missing from evolution theory is that evolution was a dual process. It was involutionarily physical and organic on the surface, and intelligently self-creative and vitally persistent underneath and within. Both functions ultimately were to merge as the body and intelligence of Homo sapiens, inventive man. Evolution, in fact, was mostly an exteriorizing process. Everything came largely from within and was managed from within. For the first life forms, we are told the environment on the surface of the earth must have been extremely hostile. Unarguably, the difficulty was for life to obtain a foothold and to hold onto it. We are not told that behind the simple life forms was a vast psychic network, a brain controlled by its own incredible intelligence. However much the tormented earth writhed and its elements lashed, the brain responded from within with a viable organic mutation that somewhere, somehow, adapted and survived. What vital life lacked within physical capability and resource, the brain made up for in timeless persistence and genius for adaptiveness. The species did not, and still does not, evolve in the external materialistic way science and evolution theory maintain. The external mechanistic and chemical changes occurring within the cells, tissues, and organs were merely the effects of this amazing psychic system of interchange, of information between every living form. All life that dies on earth survives in the psyche. In the beginning, life which had survived death on earth had no particular form in the psychic field. Life on the surface was too simple for the surviving psychic energies to have individual shape or conscious identity. But as the developing species became more firmly and abundantly entrenched on Earth, psychic doubles, or doppelgangers, vital replicas of the organisms, began appearing in the psychic mass. Compared to their physical counterparts, the doppelgangers possessed a more intense and enduring reality. The psychic doubles constantly changed their energetic frequency or image, but they did not die as we apprehend death. The purpose of evolution at any time is to make life on Earth more conscious. The first life forms possessed the minimal consciousness, instinct. Instinct can be called the consciousness of the unconscious. It is the experience or knowledge of having survived life and death, plus the urge to live or experience again. All life is instinctive because all life has survived death. But there was a limit to how far instinct could serve the purpose of increasing consciousness in the species. Instinct is concerned with survival and the blind repetition of experience. It is instantaneous, immediate in its response. It could never provide sufficient pause in the awareness of the species to sustain reflective self-consciousness. The next evolutionary requirement for that, more sophisticated bodies or organisms had to be evolved. The transfer from psychic to genetic control not only made possible the evolution of the highest class of vertebrates, the mammals and primates, it also prepared the way for probably the most climacteric evolutionary step of all. It would eventually allow the last order of the species, man, to begin the step up out of the psyche into the world, into his, by now potentially prepared, physical body. All he would have to do would be to gradually realize, enter consciously, the various senses in the exteriorized brain that had been partly developed for him by the rest of the species. In so doing, he would be helping to evolve the senses and his physical body to the point of readiness for his final, triumphal entry into the world as a self-conscious being. Primitive man's body, when the drive to self-consciousness began, would have been barely recognizable beside the human body today. He had only just evolved to the physical means of sight. Sight as we know it was the last physical sense to develop. All his senses were then present in an external body, but only in rudimentary form. It took several 100,000 years to realize the senses. That is, for the intelligence within to exteriorize itself, or put another way, for man to come to his senses. Meanwhile, primitive man lived mostly in his vital double. He did not realize he possessed a physical body. His body performed on the earth in a totally instinctive way, while the vital, feeling part of him lived completely interiorized, though parallel, psychic existence. Primitive man was not an individual as we today can experience ourselves. We have separative feelings of separate bodies, separate experiences. Primitive man experienced the world as himself. He could not think. He did not smell or hear things through his nose or ears, or use his memory to identify these perceptions as we do. He used a completely subjective internal sense-relatedness, which was truly remarkable, compared to our self-conscious understanding. Primitive man was the consciousness center of the vital or psychic brain, the most advanced and sensitive point in the world organism. He was linked to his environment by an interiorized system of psychic sense, not neural or sense-perceptive sense, which kept him constantly informed in relation to his needs. His range of experience was greater than that of any living thing. All earth life served to inform him through the incredible maze of his feeling brain. This is reflected in the story of Genesis, in which man is given dominion over every living thing. Man had this control and superiority by virtue of his central part in creation, as the power of intelligence in and behind all life. When primitive man needed food, he knew psychically in which direction to go and hunt for it. This is the essence of instinct. The nearest food, plant, animal communicated its presence to him through the psychic network, of which he was the center. The point is that primitive man knew, through being at the center of a subjective world data system, where to go to find what he needed without exterior sense aids. This original inner sense system is present in our bodies today. It persists in part as our faculty of imagination. Primitive man felt pain, but he did not know whose pain it was. A headache is my headache, my exclusive pain. But it was not for primitive man. When he felt pain, he was pain. There was no sense of self to claim it as his. Pain was the same for all. When he fought with another man or animal, he did not know which pain was his. While modern man, with his sense of self-consciousness, selects things to own apart from his pain, my child, my house, etc., primitive man was a sort of corporate feeling of all the things he required to survive. To him it was not just his world, he was the world. Primitive man's battles were actually fought within himself, within his feeling brain or plexus. While his outer body might have gone through the actions of combat, he merely registered the feelings or sensations of what was going on in his internal world, which was instantaneous, as in its communication to him, as our sense perceptions are today. The difference was that there were no images, no concepts, no forms. As primitive man's state is compared with that of today, a striking difference reveals itself. Primitive man did not want, he desired. These are not the same sensations. Wanting is a symptom of developing self-consciousness, discontent. Wanting is violence, a necessary transition on the way to self-consciousness. Desire, on the other hand, arises from the need to survive and is fundamental to life. Primitive man, as the intelligent focus of all life on earth, was the receptor of the feelings expressed by his environment. This today we experience as our love of nature, or if it is threatening or hostile, as our dislike or fear of it. But as his being began evolving emotionally toward the moment of self-consciousness, he increasingly sought the stimulus of vegetation. Trees to him were like water sprouts, and water, even in plant forms, is the medium of incipient emotion or feelings. We are, as science tells us, mostly composed of water, or in terms of this philosophy, emotion. Even today, emotionally excitable man is driven to live in the heat to dry him out. Less emotional man seeks the cold and damp to keep him supple, and man who prefers to live in the ice regions is a hybrid with his place in the same astonishing complex. Deep space, or cosmic consciousness, towards which man is heading, contains very little heat, water, or emotion. The consciousness of deep space consists mostly of an energy, a quality, called love. On a particular day, primitive man watched the sun rise in the east. No man before had ever seen the sun rising. He was never to be the same again. As he watched, cosmic culture was embodied in him, and the birth of self-conscious man began. Sunlight is more than the energy that has been measured and evaluated across the existing scientific spectrum. It has a finer and higher psychic/occult spectrum. Sunlight contains the initiating force behind self-consciousness. The sun had shone on the earth for immeasurable time, its eastern origins and western demise often obscured by clouds and mists of the cooling, settling planet. But what had utterly obscured the sun from cognitive existence was a membrane that lies behind all animal eyes, which I have called the Veil of Epicness. On this day, both the horizon and the opaque veil in primitive man had cleared. The sun's rays were electric, penetrating the muddied mists of his unconscious through to his psychic double. From deep within, another kind of sun or light, man, the principle of intelligence, the germ potential of self-consciousness, responded faintly, and so began the long exteriorizing journey to existence. It must be emphasized that the drive to self-consciousness awakened in man on that particular day in the East had to have an external trigger, sunlight. The physical organ that finally made this momentous cosmic culturing possible was the pineal gland. Science has yet to discover that the mysterious pineal gland was the original seat of consciousness of man. Eventually, when the suitable body was ready, the consciousness exteriorized itself through the pineal gland to become I, who am reading these words. As the senses of the species evolved, so did the pineal. Their development was parallel. The two were intimately linked, yet separated for millions of years, until the day described above, when the pineal gland provided the means for the ultimate superior sense, creative intelligence, to start coming forward. The appearance of the pineal gland in the species coincided with the appearance of the first of the superior senses, sound. The difference between man and beast, at all times and in all ages that have been and are yet to come, lies in what I call the Veil of Epicness. This is a psychic membrane stretched across the back of all optical organs that have not yet evolved to that particularity of excellence known as the human eye. The psychic membrane is not an abstract notion. As soon as science concentrates seriously on finding a method for measuring the energies of the psychic spectrum, perhaps it will be a new century breakthrough. The membrane will be easily located. The human eye, in spite of sharper vision elsewhere in the animal kingdom, is distinct among all eyes in having no psychic membrane. This gives man's vision a unique reflective factor, which increases enormously the depth or significance of what he sees, and hence perception and cognition. Freed of the membrane, man is able to reflect his awareness as perception through the posterior vital double and back onto the intellect behind. This reflective depth peculiar to man determines two things. First, the power of the intellect related to the sense-perceived world, and second, depending on the clarity of the psychic double through which the reflection must pass, the power of insight into psychic, spiritual, and occult realities. In the evolution of all the species, the Veil of Epicness and the Pineal Gland were intimately, vitally connected. The function of the veil was to shield the pineal from the effects of sunlight until such times as a suitable potential animal body had been evolved on Earth for I, the intelligence of man. The pineal gland was the finest of all the Earth's sensors connected to the psychic network. For scores of millions of years, it had lain virtually dormant in the skulls of the developing craniates, not unlike a sensitive fire alarm device, requiring a certain intensity of heat to set it off. All that stood in the way was the psychic membrane, which also may be called the membrane of forgetfulness. The vanishing of the animal veil allowed the energy of sunlight to stream through the optics and trigger the pineal gland. The pineal transmitted the signal posteriorly through the psychic double to the intelligence within. At once, the I or creative man set out after the senses to eventually take his place amongst the rest of the species on Earth. For primitive man living his interiorized existence at the center of the psychic mass, this meant the excruciating task of externalizing his consciousness so that he could realize or relate to his physical senses and one day live in the world as we do today. It was an unimaginably traumatic, painful, and time-extruding process. Primitive man had to be turned inside out emotionally and psychologically.